I'm a skeptic that the Common Core will have any effect on student achievement. I've been conducting research that indicates that, and I want to share some of that with you today. The basic approach is to take the Common Core as I would, say, a stock that I'm going to invest in. I would look at its past performance, or this reveals too much about my childhood, but if I were going to bet on a racehorse, I would also look at past performance to try to predict future performance. So here are some studies I've conducted. One took state standards that have existed in the past and asked the question, is there any correlation between state standards, the quality of those standards, and student achievement gains? And it turns out there's none. So I used the Fordham rankings, but I've used other rankings and looked at this question. Take a look at the correlation coefficients. Correlation coefficients, if it's -1, it's a perfectly inverse relationship. When one value goes up, the other one goes down. +1, it's a perfectly positive relationship. These values are around 0, and it doesn't matter if we look at the Fordham's rankings in 2000, 2006, or if we look at the change. The relationship, there simply is no statistical relationship between the quality of standards and whether or not students made progress. You have a state like California that has excellent standards, made very little progress under those standards. Another state like Massachusetts with comparable excellent standards did make significant progress. In a second study, what I did is look at, perhaps it's not the standards or the quality of standards, maybe it's the rigor of the standards. So I looked at where the states have set their cut points for proficiency and asked the question, did the states that set their cut points very high, they had high expectations for kids, did they score higher on NAEP and make larger NAEP gains than the states that had very low expectations? And again, there are very weak relationships. Now, there is a positive relationship in 4th grade. If you look at the last column, the states that raised their standard, their proficiency level between 05 and 09, they did make significant progress in both 4th grade reading and 4th grade math. That's the good news. The bad news is these correlation coefficients, even though they're statistically significant, they're actually quite weak in a real world sense. It's about a half a NAEP point over 4 years, which is really quite small. And there's no effect at all at 8th grade. Here's one of the reasons why standards are like pushing on a string in order to get change in achievement. Most of the variation in student achievement does not lie between states. It lies within states. So we all know, for example, there is a huge difference on NAEP between, say, Massachusetts, which scores right at the top, and Mississippi that scores at the bottom. What is overlooked by the standards theory is that every single state in the union has a mini Massachusetts-Mississippi gap within its own borders. And if standards were going to effectively eradicate that, they should have already done it, because all the states have had standards, and yet we don't see that. If you take a look, the multiple actually, this very final column, shows you the multiple, how much within state variation exceeds between state variation. Within state variation is 4 to 5 times larger. The difference between students within a state, and all the states have had standards, so they should have eradicated that if standards were going to have any effect. The real variation is within states and not between them. I would expect Common Core to affect between state variation, but not variation within. Finally, I looked at the early innings of implementation. So we're currently implementing Common Core. In 2011, the federal government surveyed the chief state school officers, and they asked them, what have you been doing with all the stimulus money that we gave you and all the Common Core funding we've given you? What have you done with that in terms of implementation? I took the answers to that survey and I sorted the states into 3 bins. Strong states, these are states that said, we've spent money on professional development, we've spent money buying new materials, we've joined one of the consortia, we've adopted the standards. On the other side, we know we have 5 states that are non-adopters, right? They have nothing to do with Common Core. And then I just threw all the others in the middle, called them medium Common Core states. Here, take a look at the last column. Here are the NAEP gains for these 3 groups. There's not a statistical difference between the 3 groups. The strongest group did gain more, but you can see it's kind of a sloppy gain in terms of if you break down the 2 time periods. The non-adopters gained the least, but here's the point I want to make. You see the difference between the non-adopters and the strong states? 1.2 NAEP points. That's over 4 years. That is so small, it is absolutely unnoticeable in the real world. It's like standing, if I were to move over and stand on 6 pieces of paper, that's how much it would change my height. So it's a very small gain, and it would take about 24 years before even a small noticeable gain would occur if it keeps going at that same rate. So why are the effects so weak? Our past experience with standards shows that the effects are weak. And I think the main reason is when you talk to Common Core advocates, they say, well, it's not the standards. Of course, standards by themselves won't have an effect on student achievement. It's implementation. Well, it turns out when you ask them what implementation is, it's everything that happens after standards, and these are pretty important things. So curriculum, instruction, assessment, accountability, all of these things have to go well for the standards to have an impact on student achievement. And we do know that all 4 vary in quality from state to state, from district to district, from school to school. Those of you who have kids in school, even within schools, from classroom to classroom. These things vary in quality. So I would expect some of them will be excellent, some will be quite bad, and they're all going to wash out to a very small effect or no effect whatsoever.